My sister-in-law called me the poor aunt because I am a teacher. I showed her how much money I have and bought her house. Beverly called me the poor aunt at my niece's 10th birthday party. She said it right through in front of all the kids while I was handing Madison a handmade quilt I'd spent 3 months making. Oh look, Aunt Julia made you another homemade gift because she can't afford to shop at real stores like Mommy. Madison's face fell. She'd been excited about the quilt 2 seconds earlier. I taught high school history. Beverly married a pharmaceutical sales rep who made 80 times my salary. She drove a white Range Rover, lived in a 5-bedroom house, wore designer everything. I drove a Toyota Camry, rented a 1-bedroom apartment, shopped at Target. To her, that meant I was poor. For 5 years, every family gathering was the same. Julia's here with her homemade gifts. Julia shops at thrift stores because teacher salary. Julia can't come to the spa with us, it's not in her budget. She'd say this while her kids opened their 20th toy that month. Another piece of plastic they'd forget existed in 3 days. What Beverly didn't know was that I lived cheap by choice. My grandmother left me her investment portfolio when she died 7 years ago. $2 million in stocks and bonds. I never touched it, just let it grow. Lived on my teacher salary, saved every penny I could, watched that portfolio hit $3 million last year. But Beverly saw my apartment and assumed I was broke. Christmas was the worst. She'd make a big show of giving me expensive gifts in front of everyone. I know you can't afford nice things, so I wanted you to have this. A designer purse I'd never use. An expensive perfume that gave me headaches, always with that pitying smile. Her kids started repeating it. Mom says we should be nice to Aunt Julia because she's poor. Mom says Aunt Julia can't take us places because teachers don't make money. Mom says we should appreciate Aunt Julia's homemade gifts even though they're not as good as store-bought. I kept my mouth shut for years. Until last month, when Beverly showed up at my apartment at 11 at night, crying. Their house was being foreclosed. Turns out her husband Bra D had been living a lie. The pharmaceutical job was real, but he'd been gambling his entire salary for 3 years. Online poker, sports betting, casino trips disguised as war, conferences. They were 6 months behind on the mortgage, credit cards maxed out, car about to be repossessed. I need $200,000, she sobbed. I know you have savings. Teachers are good at saving. Please, Julia. My kids will be homeless. The poor aunt doesn't have that kind of money, I said. Stop playing games, she snapped, tears drying instantly. I know you have something saved. You never spend money on anything. Because I'm poor, remember? That's what you tell everyone. This is serious. My kids need a home. Then maybe you should have saved money instead of spending it on Range Rovers and designer bags. She left screaming that I was heartless, jealous, bitter about my pathetic life. The next day, she told our entire family I had refused to help, that I was willing to let her kids suffer because of petty resentment. Our parents called me, aunts called me, cousins called me, everyone saying I should help if I could. That family comes first, that the kids shouldn't suffer for adult problems. So I decided to help. Just not how Beverly expected. I called my friend Robert who worked in real estate. Found out Beverly's house was going to auction in 2 weeks. 5-bedroom colonial in the best school district. Market value of $800,000. Would probably sell for $500 at auction. I showed up to the auction with a cashier's check. Beverly was there with Brad, crying as their house went on the block. When the auctioneer started, she saw me in the crowd. Her face lit up. She thought I was there to save them. I was. Just not for them. I bought the house for $520,000 cash. Outbid 3 other investors. Beverly ran over after I signed the papers. Thank you. I knew you'd come through. When can we move back in? You're not moving back in, I said. I bought it as an investment property. Her face went white. What? I'm going to rent it out. Market rate is $4,000 a month. You can apply if you want, but you'll need first, last, and security deposit. Plus solid credit, which you don't have. You bought my house to rent it back to me? I bought a house at auction. It's not yours anymore. Brad stepped forward. You can't do this to family. Actually, I can. Just like you could tell your kids I'm the poor aunt who can't afford real gifts. I turned to Beverly. By the way, my portfolio is worth $3 million. I could have bought your house twice over. But the poor aunt doesn't help people who treat her like garbage. The best part came 2 weeks later. Beverly's face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. First shock, then this weird confusion like she couldn't process what I'd just said, then rage that made her whole body go stiff. Brad grabbed her arm and tried to pull her away from the courthouse steps, but she wouldn't move. She just stood there staring at me like I'd turned into a completely different person right in front of her. Her mouth opened and closed a few times without any sound coming out. Brad kept tugging on her arm, saying something about leaving, about going home, but she shook him off. The other people from the auction were filing past us, some of them looking over with obvious curiosity. I turned and walked toward my car before she could find her voice. My phone started going crazy before I even made it across the parking lot. It was vibrating so hard in my purse that I could feel it against my hip. I pulled it out and saw 12 missed calls already, 3 from my mother, 2 from my brother Cooper, The rest from numbers I didn't recognize. Text messages were flooding in too. Mom said, "Call me right now," in all caps. Cooper sent 5 question marks in a row. Beverly had apparently found time to leave me 12 voice messages in the 2 minutes since I'd walked away from her. I deleted them all without listening. I knew exactly what they'd say anyway. Heather lived 20 minutes away in a neighborhood almost as nice as Beverly's old one. I drove there on autopilot, my hands shaking a little on the steering wheel. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already standing on her front porch like she'd been watching for me. She must have seen something in my face because she disappeared inside and came back out with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses before I even made it to the door. We sat on her back deck and she poured while I told her everything. The auction, Beverly's face when she realized I was bidding, the moment I signed the papers, the conversation on the courthouse steps. Heather didn't interrupt once, just listened and kept my glass full. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute, then asked if I was actually okay with what I'd done. Not whether it was right or wrong, not whether I should have done it, just whether I was okay. I thought about lying, about saying I felt great, about saying Beverly deserved it. But Heather was the only person who knew the whole story, who'd heard every mean comment over the years, who wouldn't judge me either way. The truth was I felt good and sick at the same time. Good because Beverly finally knew I wasn't the poor aunt she could look down on. Sick because I kept seeing Madison's face at the auction, the way she'd been crying into Beverly's shoulder. Heather nodded like that made perfect sense. She reminded me that Beverly had created this whole situation by spending money they didn't have and treating me like garbage for 5 years. She said the foreclosure would have happened whether I bought the house or not, that some investor would have gotten it anyway. But the guilt still sat in my chest like a rock. Madison was 10 years old. She didn't choose to have a mom who was mean or a dad who gambled away their house. She just wanted her room back. My father showed up at my apartment that night around 9. I heard the knock and looked through the peephole, and there he was standing in the hallway. He'd never come to my apartment before. Not once in the 3 years I'd lived there. I thought about not answering, about pretending I wasn't home, but his car was in the parking lot and he'd seen my lights on. I opened the door. He didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me with this disappointed expression that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. He asked how I could do this to family, to children, to my own niece. His voice was so quiet and sad that it was worse than if he'd been screaming. I tried to explain about the 5 years of comments, about Beverly calling me poor in front of everyone, about the kids learning to look down on me because their mother did. Dad listened, but his face didn't change. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he didn't know it had been that bad, that he should have paid more attention, but he said buying the house was still too far, that I'd hurt innocent children to get back at their mother. I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I couldn't find the words. He left after 10 minutes and I sat on my couch feeling like the worst person alive. My mother called at 7 the next morning. I was still in bed, hadn't slept much, and her name lit up my phone screen. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd just keep calling. The second I said hello, she started screaming. Not talking loud, actually screaming. She said I was selfish, cruel, vindictive, that those children would be homeless because of me, that I should be ashamed of myself for putting revenge above family, that she didn't raise me to be this kind of person, that she was embarrassed to be my mother right now. I held the phone away from my ear and let her yell. When she paused to take a breath, I hung up. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. Cooper texted me an hour later. He said Mom was at Beverly's rental apartment helping them unpack. He said Beverly was telling everyone I was a monster who wanted to see children suffer. He said he wanted to hear my side before he decided anything. At least Cooper was willing to listen. I texted back that I'd meet him for coffee tomorrow, that I'd explain everything. He sent back a thumbs up. Work on Monday was weird. Heather must have told her husband Dominic the whole story, because he was waiting for me in the teacher's lounge before first period. Dominic was a real estate investor, owned like 15 rental properties around town. He cornered me by the coffee maker and started talking about rental property management. He said what I did was smart business, that buying at auction was the best way to build wealth. He wanted to know what I was planning for market rate, whether I'd use a property manager, how I'd handle maintenance. He was treating the whole thing like a normal investment deal, not like I'd just destroyed my family relationships. Part of me appreciated that he didn't think I was a monster. Part of me felt even worse because he was right that it was good business and that made it sound cold. My principal walked in halfway through this conversation. She stopped in the doorway and gave me this really odd look. I could see her brain working, trying to figure out why a high school history teacher was talking about investment properties and auction purchases. I realized right then that I needed to be way more careful about who knew about my money. The whole point of living cheap was that nobody knew about my grandmother's portfolio. If people found out I had $3 million, everything would change. Teachers would treat me differently. Parents would expect me to donate to every fundraiser. The principal might wonder if I was really committed to teaching or just doing it as a hobby. I wrapped up the conversation with Dominic fast and made a mental note to keep my mouth shut about my finances from now on. I walked into the cafeteria Tuesday during my lunch period, and Beverly was already there waiting by the vending machines. Her face was red and blotchy like she'd been crying for hours. She spotted me the second I came through the door and started walking fast toward my usual table near the windows. I tried to turn around and leave, but she was already too close, and her voice got loud enough that students at nearby tables stopped eating to watch. She started yelling about how I stole her house and ruined her children's lives, and how Madison cried herself to sleep every night on an air mattress in their cramped two-bedroom apartment. Her voice got louder with every sentence, and students were pulling out their phones to record. I just stood there holding my lunch bag while she screamed that I was heartless and cruel, and that her kids deserved better than sleeping on the floor because their aunt was petty and vindictive. 2 security guards showed up within maybe 3 minutes, and had to physically escort her out while she kept screaming down the hallway that I was destroying her family. The whole cafeteria went silent after she left, and every single person was staring at me. I walked straight to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall for the rest of lunch period. The principal called me to his office right after 6th period ended. He sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable and asked if everything was okay at home. I explained as little as possible, just said there was a family disagreement about money and property, and that my sister-in-law was upset about a business decision I made. He listened and nodded and then asked if I needed a restraining order against her. I said no, that she was just emotional and it wouldn't happen again. He gave me this look that said he didn't quite believe me, and told me that personal drama couldn't disrupt the school environment again, or he'd have to get administration involved. I promised it wouldn't, and left his office feeling like a kid who just got caught cheating on a test. My phone rang at 7 that evening while I was grading papers on my couch. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I answered anyway. A woman introduced herself as Kira Lovell, Madison's school counselor. She said Madison had been acting out in class for the past week, talking back to teachers and getting into arguments with other kids during recess. She'd also been crying a lot, sometimes right in the middle of lessons for no clear reason. Kira said she wanted to reach out because Madison talked about me constantly during their counseling sessions and clearly missed me a lot. She asked if there was any way I could reach out to Madison or maybe visit her, that it might help with whatever Madison was going through. I told her the situation was complicated and that I'd think about it. She gave me her direct number and said to call any time if I wanted to talk more about Madison's emotional state. After I hung up, the guilt hit me so hard I had to put my head between my knees. Madison didn't do anything wrong. She was just a 10-year-old kid who got caught in the middle of adult problems she couldn't understand. She didn't tell me I was poor or make fun of my homemade gifts. That was all Beverly. But Madison was the one crying at recess and sleeping on an air mattress and losing her house. Kira called me back 20 minutes later and gently suggested that maybe I could maintain a relationship with Madison separate from whatever issues I had with Beverly. She said kids need stable adult relationships during times of family stress. I told her I didn't know how that would work with Beverly hating me so much. Kira said she understood, but that Madison's well-being should come first. I agreed to think about it more seriously. Cooper texted me Wednesday morning asking if I could meet him for coffee after school. I said yes, and we met at the place near his apartment at 4. He looked tired when he walked in, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He sat down across from me and admitted right away that he was caught in the middle of this whole mess. He said he understood why I was angry at Beverly after hearing more details from Mom about the poor aunt comments. But he was also watching his nieces and nephews struggle in a cramped apartment with barely any furniture, while I owned a 5-bedroom house sitting completely empty. He said the kids kept asking him when they could go back home and he didn't know what to tell them. I explained that the house wasn't going to sit empty forever. I was renting it out as an investment property, which was standard practice when you bought a foreclosed house at auction. Cooper stirred his coffee and asked quietly if I'd consider renting to Beverly at a reduced rate, maybe something she could actually afford on her retail salary. I laughed, but it came out bitter and mean. I told him there was no way I was giving Beverly a discount after everything she'd said and done. Cooper nodded like he expected that answer but looked disappointed anyway. He told me that Beverly's other 2 children were younger than Madison, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They didn't fully understand what happened with the foreclosure, or why they had to leave their house so suddenly. Cooper said they kept asking when they could go back to their real house and see their old rooms again. Then he paused and looked down at his coffee cup before telling me that Beverly was telling them Aunt Julia stole their house from them, that I took it away on purpose because I was mean and didn't want them to be happy. I felt my face get hot and asked if he was serious. He nodded and said Beverly was painting me as the villain to her own kids. My property manager called me Friday afternoon while I was setting up a lab experiment for my afternoon classes. She said she found a potential tenant family who seemed perfect. Nice couple with 2 kids who both had stable jobs and excellent credit scores. They could afford the $4,000 monthly rent easily and wanted to sign a 2-year lease. She was sending me their application and references and said I should approve them as soon as possible before they found something else. I told her I'd look at everything over the weekend and get back to her Monday. That night, I got a long email from my mother. The subject line was just, "Please reconsider," and the email was 3 full paragraphs begging me to think about the children. She said Madison was having nightmares and the younger kids didn't understand why they couldn't go home. She said Beverly was working 2 jobs now trying to make ends meet and barely saw her kids. She said the children were suffering and that I had the power to help them, but was choosing not to. She ended the email by saying she raised me to be better than this, and that she was praying I'd find compassion in my heart. I didn't respond to the email, but I also couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Madison's face at her birthday party when she first saw the quilt I made her. She'd been so excited, running her hands over the stitching and asking how long it took me to make. Then Beverly made that comment about homemade gifts and poor aunts, and Madison's whole face changed. The quilt that took me 3 months to make, that I'd chosen fabrics for so carefully, that I'd stitched by hand because I wanted it to be special. Beverly dismissed it as worthless in 5 seconds because it was homemade, because I was poor, because I couldn't afford real store-bought gifts like she could. Heather found me crying in my classroom Friday after school. I was sitting at my desk with my head in my hands and she knocked on the doorframe before coming in. She asked what happened and I told her everything. The email from my mother, the call from Madison's counselor, Cooper asking me to give Beverly a discount, the younger kids thinking I stole their house. I told her I was starting to wonder if I went too far, if proving a point to Beverly was worth making 3 children suffer, if I was actually the villain in this whole story after all. Heather sat across from me in my classroom and waited while I wiped my eyes on my sleeve. She didn't try to fix anything or tell me what to do, just let me cry until I ran out of tears. When I finally looked up, she handed me a tissue and said, Beverly had 6 months to save that house before the foreclosure happened. 6 months where she could have cut back on spending, could have noticed Brad's behavior, could have done something instead of buying more designer bags and taking spa trips. She reminded me that Brad's gambling destroyed their finances, not me, that I didn't create this situation by refusing to hand over $200,000 to someone who'd spent 5 years treating me like garbage. But then she got quiet and admitted that holding on to this anger might hurt me more than it hurt Beverly at this point. She said revenge felt good in the moment, but carrying around all this bitterness was going to eat me alive, and she could see it happening already. I wanted to argue with her, but I couldn't because she was right. I'd proven my point, shown Beverly I wasn't the poor aunt she thought I was, but now I was stuck owning her house and watching 3 kids suffer for their parents' mistakes. Saturday morning, I was making coffee in my apartment when someone knocked on my door. I opened it and found Madison standing in my hallway crying. Her face was red and blotchy, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she was wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in 2 days ago. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds, trying to figure out how she got my address or how she got here because she was 10 years old and shouldn't be showing up at apartments alone. She started talking immediately, words tumbling out between sobs about how she needed me to give her house back. She said she'd do anything, that she missed her room so much she couldn't sleep at night, that all her friends lived in her old neighborhood, and she couldn't see them anymore. She missed her backyard where she used to play, and her window that looked out at the big tree, and her closet where she kept all her stuffed animals that didn't fit in the tiny apartment. I just stood there frozen, because this was so far beyond anything I'd expected that my brain couldn't process it. I pulled out my phone and called Beverly immediately. My hands were shaking as I waited for her to answer, and when she did, I didn't even say hello. I asked her if she told Madison where I live, and she went quiet for a second before admitting she did. She said she gave Madison bus money and told her which bus to take, that she thought maybe Madison could change my mind since adults weren't getting through to me. I felt rage flood through my body, hot and sharp, because she was using her own daughter as a tool to manipulate me. I told her I was furious that she'd send a 10-year-old across town on a bus to beg for something she had no control over. Beverly started to say something, but I cut her off and said Madison was standing in my doorway crying, and I was letting her inside because I wasn't going to leave a child in the hallway. I hung up before Beverly could respond. Madison came inside and sat on my couch still crying. I made her hot chocolate even though it was almost summer because that's what my grandmother used to make me when I was upset. We sat there for 2 hours and I tried to explain why I was angry at her mom. I told her that her mom said mean things to me for a long time, that she made me feel small and worthless, that she told everyone I was poor and couldn't afford nice things. Madison nodded and said she knew her mom could be mean sometimes. She said her mom said mean things about other people too, about their neighbors and her dad's coworkers, and even about Madison's teachers. But she didn't understand why that meant she had to lose her house. She said it wasn't fair that grown-ups were fighting, and she was the one who had to leave her friends and her school and everything she knew. I didn't have a good answer for that because she was right. It wasn't fair to her. I drove Madison back to Beverly's apartment in my Camry. She sat in the passenger seat quiet now, holding the empty hot chocolate mug in her lap like she didn't want to let it go. When we pulled up to the apartment complex, Beverly was standing outside waiting. She had this look on her face that made my stomach turn, sort of smug and satisfied like she thought sending Madison had worked. I got out of the car and walked Madison to her mother, and then I looked Beverly straight in the eye and told her if she ever used her children to manipulate me again, I would file for a restraining order. Beverly's face went pale and the smug look disappeared. She opened her mouth to say something, but I was already walking back to my car. I heard her call Madison inside as I drove away. That week, I learned more about Brad's gambling than I ever wanted to know. Cooper called me Tuesday night and told me Brad's situation was worse than anyone realized. He didn't just lose their mortgage money gambling. He took out credit cards in Beverly's name without telling her, maxed them all out at casinos and online poker sites. He borrowed against his 401k, took out a personal loan he couldn't pay back, and apparently owed money to some people who'd been calling their apartment making threats. Cooper said Beverly was scared, that she'd filed a police report about the credit cards but didn't know what to do about the people calling. I asked how much Brad owed these people, and Cooper said he didn't know exactly, but it was enough that Beverly was considering moving to a different state. Cooper also told me that Brad's parents were helping with rent and groceries, but they were retired and living on Social Security, and they couldn't keep supporting 3 adults and 3 kids long term. Beverly's parents died in a car accident years ago, so she didn't have that support system. She'd been applying for jobs but hadn't worked in 12 years, and nobody wanted to hire someone with that big a gap in their resume. The only offers she got were minimum wage retail jobs that wouldn't cover even half their expenses. Cooper said he was helping where he could, but he had his own family to support, and couldn't carry Beverly's family too. Thursday afternoon, Dominic caught me in the parking lot after school. He said he needed to tell me something about Brad that I should probably know. Apparently, Brad's employer was investigating him for falsifying expense reports. For the past 2 years, Brad had been claiming business trips and client dinners that never happened, pocketing the reimbursement money to fund his gambling. The company found out during a routine audit, and now they were building a case against him. Dominic said Brad would probably lose his job entirely, maybe even face criminal charges depending on how much money was involved. If Brad lost his job, they'd have no income except whatever minimum wage work Beverly could find. The situation wasn't just bad anymore. It was getting worse every single day. My mother called me Friday morning before school started. Her voice was calmer this time, not screaming like before, and she asked if we could meet in person to talk. I almost said no, but something in her tone made me agree. We met for lunch at a chain restaurant halfway between her house and my apartment, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage. She started by apologizing for screaming at me on the phone. She said she was scared for her grandchildren and that fear made her lash out at me when I didn't deserve it. Then she said she was worried about Madison, about the younger kids, about their mental health and stability. She said kids needed routine and security, and right now they had neither. I took a deep breath and told my mother everything. Every comment Beverly made over 5 years, every time she called me the poor aunt in front of the kids, every pitying look and condescending gift. I told her about the birthday party and the quilt I spent 3 months making that Beverly dismissed in 5 seconds. I told her about Christmas gifts given with fake sympathy, about being excluded from family activities because of my supposed budget, about Beverly's kids repeating that I was poor and couldn't afford real presents. My mother went quiet and stared at her salad. After a long silence, she admitted she noticed some of it, but thought I was being too sensitive. She said she figured Beverly was just joking around, that sisters-in-law tease each other and I should have thicker skin. I asked her if she'd want someone talking to her that way for 5 years, and she didn't answer. She asked if there was any way I'd consider helping. I stirred my iced tea and watched the condensation drip down the glass. I told her I wasn't giving Beverly the house and I wasn't renting to her at a discount. My mother's face fell. She set down her fork and stared at her plate for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and said she understood I needed boundaries, even if she wished I'd chosen differently. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We finished lunch talking about other things, safer things, but the tension sat between us like a third person at the table. The property manager called me Tuesday afternoon while I was grading essays. The potential tenant family found another place. They'd signed a lease somewhere else over the weekend. The house was still vacant. I thanked her and hung up, then sat staring at the stack of papers in front of me. The carrying costs were minimal since I owned the house outright. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, lawn maintenance, maybe $1,500 a month total. But it felt wasteful leaving a 5-bedroom house empty when I could be generating rental income. I pulled up the listing on my laptop and stared at the photos. Beverly's furniture was gone, the walls were bare, but I could still see Madison's birthday party in that living room, the quilt moment that started everything. Thursday morning, Heather caught me in the parking lot before first period. Her daughter Adeline had something to tell me, she said. Adeline babysat Madison sometimes now that Beverly was working retail hours. Apparently Madison talked about me constantly. My stomach twisted. Heather said Madison had my quilt on her air mattress in the cramped apartment. She slept with it every night. It was the only thing from her old room she'd managed to keep when they moved out. Everything else got sold or donated or left behind. But Madison grabbed that quilt. The one Beverly had mocked. The one she'd dismissed as worthless. I had to turn away so Heather wouldn't see my face. My parents invited the whole family to Sunday dinner. The text came Friday evening, including me and Beverly. Cooper called me an hour later to warn me that Dad wanted to mediate some kind of resolution. He said I didn't have to go if I wasn't ready. I almost said no. Almost deleted the text and pretended I never saw it. But curiosity won out. I wanted to see Beverly face to face. Wanted to see what 5 weeks in a cramped apartment had done to her. So I texted back that I'd be there. Sunday arrived cold and gray. I drove to my parents' house with my hands tight on the steering wheel. Cooper's car was already in the driveway. So was Beverly's. Not the Range Rover anymore. Some beat-up sedan I didn't recognize. I sat in my Camry for 5 minutes gathering courage. Then I walked inside. The dinner was exactly as awkward as expected. Beverly sat across from me at the table looking exhausted and defeated instead of angry. She'd lost weight. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by plain jeans and a faded sweater. Her hair needed cutting. Her nails were bare instead of manicured. She looked like a completely different person than the smug woman at Madison's birthday party. She barely looked at me during the meal. Just pushed food around her plate and answered questions in one-word responses. My father waited until we'd finished eating. Then he cleared his throat and suggested family therapy with everyone present. I immediately refused. Told him therapy wouldn't change anything, wouldn't fix what was broken. Beverly surprised me by agreeing. She said therapy wouldn't change the fact that I owned her house and she couldn't afford to live there anymore. Her voice was flat, empty. My mother started to argue, but my father held up his hand. Madison spoke up then. She asked me directly, in front of everyone, why I hated her mom so much that I'd take their house. The table went completely silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. I stared at this 10-year-old girl with tears in her eyes and I didn't know what to say. How do you explain adult conflicts to a child? How do you tell her that her mother spent 5 years making me feel small and worthless without making her mother sound terrible? How do you justify buying someone's house at auction to a kid who just wants her bedroom back? I told Madison I didn't hate her, that I loved her very much. But her mom hurt my feelings many times and I got angry. The words sounded hollow even as I said them. It was an oversimplification that made me sound petty. Made me sound like I'd destroyed her family over hurt feelings. But I couldn't explain financial humiliation to a 10-year-old. Couldn't explain what it felt like to be called the poor aunt in front of children for 5 years. Couldn't explain class superiority and condescension to someone who still believed adults were basically good. Beverly did something unexpected. She looked at Madison and told her that she said mean things to me, that she hurt my feelings on purpose. That's why I was upset. It wasn't quite an apology. She didn't say sorry. Didn't say she regretted it. But it was the first time she'd admitted any fault. Everyone at the table looked shocked. My mother's mouth fell open. Cooper stopped eating mid-bite. My father leaned back in his chair like he'd been pushed. Beverly kept her eyes on Madison. Didn't look at me at all. Just told her daughter the truth in the simplest terms possible. After dinner, Beverly asked to speak to me privately. We went out to my parents' backyard where we used to play as kids. The grass was brown and the flower beds needed weeding. Beverly wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. She looked nervous and defeated. Small in a way I'd never seen her before. She said she knew I had no reason to help her. That she understood why I was angry. But she was asking anyway because she didn't know what else to do. Her voice shook. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just stared at the dead grass and waited for me to respond. I stood there in the cold backyard, watching Beverly wrap her arms tighter around herself. She looked up at me for the first time in the entire conversation, and her eyes were red from crying. She said she knew this sounded crazy after everything she'd done, but she was jealous of me for years. Jealous that I seemed happy with so little while she needed expensive things to feel like she mattered. She said she bought designer bags and drove the fancy car because she felt empty inside without them, like she wasn't worth anything if she didn't have the best stuff. The foreclosure had been the worst thing that ever happened to her, but also the most humbling, and she was sorry for every mean comment she ever made about me being poor. She knew sorry didn't fix anything or make up for 5 years of treating me like garbage. I told her I appreciated the apology, but I wasn't giving her the house back. She nodded and said she understood, that she didn't expect me to. Then she asked if I'd be willing to let Madison visit me sometimes because Madison missed me and kept asking about me. She said Madison cried about losing me almost as much as she cried about losing the house. I told her I'd think about it and she thanked me, which felt weird coming from her. We went back inside and everyone pretended we'd just been talking about normal stuff. But my mother kept glancing at me with this hopeful expression. The following week, Cooper called me during my lunch period at the school. Brad had lost his job that morning when the expense report investigation finished. Security escorted him out of the building with a box of his desk stuff, and the company was pressing charges for fraud. Their only income now was the small amount Beverly made from a part-time retail job she'd started at Target 2 weeks ago. She was working in the clothing section, folding shirts and helping customers, making maybe $12 an hour. Cooper sounded worried when he told me this because Brad's parents were pressuring them to move back to their home state where the cost of living was way lower. Brad's parents lived in Oklahoma and had a basement apartment they could use for free. Beverly didn't want to leave because it would mean pulling the kids from their schools and away from all their friends. Madison had lived in the same house her whole life, gone to the same school since kindergarten, and now everything was falling apart. Cooper asked me what I thought about the moving situation, and I told him I didn't know. After we hung up, I sat in my empty classroom and realized something that made my stomach hurt. If Beverly moved to Oklahoma, I'd probably never have a relationship with Madison or the other kids again. Oklahoma was 1,000 miles away, and Beverly sure wasn't going to drive them back here for visits. The thought bothered me way more than I expected it to. I kept seeing Madison's face when she asked why I hated her mom so much that I'd take their house. I found myself actually thinking about ways I could help without completely giving in to Beverly's manipulation. Heather found me grading papers after school that day and could tell something was wrong. I told her about the Oklahoma situation and how it was messing with my head. She sat down at the desk next to mine and suggested I could offer to let Madison stay with me on weekends. It would give Madison stability and let us rebuild our relationship while I maintained boundaries with Beverly. Madison could keep going to her same school, stay connected to her friends, and have a safe space away from all the stress at home. It wasn't a crazy idea, but I didn't know if Beverly would agree to it, or if it would just make everything more complicated. What if Beverly used it as leverage to ask for more stuff? What if Madison felt caught between us? What if I got attached to having her around and then Beverly moved anyway? Heather said those were all valid concerns, but Madison needed someone stable in her life right now, and that someone could be me if I wanted it to be. The house had been sitting empty for a month now, and I was getting anxious about finding a tenant. Empty houses cost money in utilities and property taxes even when nobody lives there, and mine was costing me about $1,500 a month just sitting vacant. Dominic stopped by my classroom one afternoon and offered to help me screen people more carefully. He said he had connections with property management companies and knew how to spot red flags in applications. We scheduled several showings for the following week, and he said he'd come with me to meet potential tenants. My property manager had been sending me applications, but none of them felt right. Some had bad credit, some had eviction histories, some just gave me weird vibes when I talked to them on the phone. I wanted good tenants who'd take care of the place and pay rent on time, but I also kept thinking about Madison's old bedroom sitting empty upstairs. A family with 3 kids came to see the house on Saturday morning. The parents were both engineers, made good money, had perfect credit scores and references from their last 2 landlords. The kids were polite and well-behaved, and the mom kept talking about how much she loved the backyard and the school district. They offered to sign a 2-year lease at full price right there on the spot, $4,000 a month with first and last month's rent plus security deposit. They were perfect tenants on paper, and I should have accepted immediately. Dominic was nodding at me like I'd be stupid not to take this deal. But I stood there in the living room where Madison used to play, and I couldn't make myself say yes. I told them I had a few other people to show the house to, and I'd let them know by Monday. They looked disappointed, but said they understood. After they left, Dominic asked me what the problem was because that family was exactly what I needed. I didn't have a good answer for him. I called Madison's counselor on Monday morning before school started. Her name was Kira, and she'd left me 2 voice messages over the past week asking if we could talk about Madison. I asked her to give me an honest opinion about Madison's emotional state, and she didn't sugarcoat anything. Madison was struggling badly. Her grades had dropped, she was getting into fights with friends, and she spent most of recess sitting alone crying. The instability at home was affecting everything, and she'd benefit a lot from having consistent, positive adults in her life. Kira said Madison talked about me in their sessions, about the quilt I made her, and how I was the only one who never made her feel bad about her family's money problems. She said Madison needed someone who could be steady and reliable when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I thanked her and hung up feeling like someone had punched me in the chest. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone for 2 hours. I thought about Madison sleeping on an air mattress in a cramped apartment. I thought about her losing her house, her room, her stability, and potentially losing me too if they moved to Oklahoma. I thought about Beverly's apology in the backyard and how broken she looked. I thought about my grandmother who left me all that money and what she would want me to do with it. She always said money was a tool, not a trophy, and the point was to use it for good things. Around 9 o'clock, I made a decision that surprised even me. I picked up my phone and called Beverly. She answered on the first ring sounding scared, probably thinking something bad had happened. I told her I'd rent her the house at $2,500 a month. It was way below market rate, but it would cover my costs and property taxes. She didn't say anything for a long time, and I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then I heard her crying and asking if I was serious, if this was real. I told her it came with a strict lease and conditions that weren't negotiable. She needed to sign a proper lease with standard terms, pay on time every month without excuses or delays, maintain the property like she owned it, keeping everything clean and functional, never mention my financial situation to anyone again, not family, not friends, not strangers at the grocery store. If she violated any terms or treated me with even a hint of disrespect, she was out immediately with no second chances. I laid out each condition clearly while she stayed silent on the other end of the phone. No negotiation, no discussion, no room for interpretation. These were my rules for my property, and she could take them or leave them. Beverly started crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She kept asking if I was serious, if this was real, if I really meant it. Her voice shook with disbelief like she couldn't process that I was actually offering this after everything that happened. I told her straight that I wasn't doing this for her benefit, or because I forgave what she'd done. This was for Madison and the other kids who didn't ask to be part of adult drama and deserved some stability in their lives. They needed their rooms back, their friends, their school, their normal routine. Beverly thanked me about 20 times while sobbing, promising she'd never be late with rent, never cause problems, never take advantage. I told her to email me by tomorrow if she wanted to move forward and hung up before she could say anything else. 2 weeks passed and Beverly signed the lease on a Tuesday morning at a coffee shop near my school. She looked different, thinner and tired, wearing jeans and a plain shirt instead of her usual designer outfits. We sat across from each other while she read through every page of the standard rental agreement I'd printed. She signed without asking for any changes or special treatment, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote her name. I handed her the keys and told her she could move in that weekend. She thanked me again, formal and stiff, like she was talking to a landlord she barely knew instead of family. That same afternoon, Brad got arrested at his parents' house where he'd been staying since the foreclosure. Beverly called me in a panic around 6 o'clock, her voice high and frantic. The police had taken him in handcuffs for the expense report fraud his company had been investigating. Turned out he wasn't just gambling his salary away. He'd been involved in some illegal gambling operation, falsifying company records to fund his addiction, and now he was facing serious criminal charges. Beverly had no idea what to do, how to handle this, whether she should bail him out or let him sit in jail. I stayed surprisingly calm while she spiraled on the phone. I gave her the name of a criminal defense lawyer Cooper knew from law school and told her she needed to think about filing for divorce. She went quiet for a long moment before admitting she'd already been considering it. Brad had destroyed their finances, lied for years, put their kids through hell, and now he was facing potential prison time. Staying married to him made no sense anymore. My parents found out about the rental arrangement when Beverly called them crying happy tears about moving back into the house. My mother phoned me the next day, her voice warm with relief and gratitude. She thanked me for helping, for being the bigger person, for putting the kids first. Then she added that she was glad I'd finally done the right thing, and something about her tone made my jaw clench. Like I'd been wrong this whole time, and only now had I corrected my mistake. I bit back the response building in my throat and just said I was glad the kids would have stability. Cooper stopped by my apartment that evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. He hugged me tight and said he was proud of me for finding a middle path between revenge and total surrender. He understood why I'd been angry, why I'd bought the house, why I'd wanted Beverly to feel what I'd felt. But he also respected that I'd found a way to help the kids without completely giving in. We ate Chinese food on my couch while he told me about the lawyer he'd recommended to Beverly and how bad Brad's legal situation looked. The gambling operation had connections to organized crime. The fraud charges were solid, and Brad was probably going to serve time. Beverly needed to protect herself and the kids by cutting ties completely. Moving day arrived on a Saturday morning in early October. I showed up at Beverly's cramped apartment at 8 to help load boxes into a rental truck Dominic had arranged. Madison ran to me the second I walked through the door and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She whispered thank you over and over while crying happy tears into my shirt. Her younger siblings bounced around excited about going back to their real house, their real rooms, their real backyard. Beverly directed the moving process with quiet efficiency, boxing up the few belongings they'd managed to fit into the small space. She thanked me 3 times that morning, each time formal and careful, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We loaded furniture and boxes for hours, making trips back and forth between the apartment and the house. Madison rode with me in my car, talking nonstop about how she'd decorate her room again, which friends she'd invite over first, how happy she was to go back to her old school. By late afternoon, everything was moved in and the kids were running through the house reclaiming their spaces. Beverly stood in the kitchen looking around with an expression I couldn't quite read. She thanked me one more time, stiff and formal, promising she'd never be late with rent or cause any problems. I believed her because she finally understood what it felt like to lose everything and have to depend on someone else's mercy. The first rent check arrived in my mailbox 5 days before it was due. Beverly had included a handwritten note on flowered stationery saying she'd gotten a better job at a medical office doing billing and administrative work. The pay was decent, the hours were stable, and she was working on rebuilding her credit score. She'd also enrolled in financial literacy classes at the community center, trying to learn the basics of budgeting and saving that she'd never bothered with before. The note was polite and distant, signed simply with her name. I deposited the check and filed the note away with my rental property records. Madison started coming over to my apartment every other weekend per the arrangement Beverly and I had worked out. She'd show up Friday evening with her backpack and homework, staying through Sunday afternoon. We were rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, without the weight of Beverly's comments poisoning everything. Madison was more mature now, more aware of adult complexities and family problems. She asked careful questions about why I'd been angry at her mom, why I'd bought the house, why I'd decided to let them move back in. I answered honestly but simply, trying to explain without making Beverly sound terrible. Madison seemed to understand in the way kids do when they've seen their parents' flaws up close. She still loved her mom but recognized that adults made mistakes and hurt each other sometimes. We spent our weekends making dinner together, working on the school projects, watching movies, talking about everything and nothing. She was still my niece, and I still loved her completely, and that relationship felt solid again in a way it hadn't for years. 6 months passed, and Brad took a plea deal that included 3 years in prison, plus restitution payments for the fraud. His lawyer had negotiated it down from the original charges, but he was still going away for a significant amount of time. Beverly's divorce was finalized 2 weeks after his sentencing. She got full custody of the kids, with Brad having supervised visitation rights after he served his sentence. The judge had been clear that Brad needed to prove he'd addressed his gambling addiction and could be a stable presence before unsupervised visits would be allowed. Beverly seemed relieved when she told me about the divorce being final, like she'd been carrying a heavy weight that had finally been lifted. She was building a new life for herself and the kids, one based on realistic budgets and honest work instead of appearances and debt. Her rent checks continued to arrive early every month with brief notes about her job or the kids' activities. We weren't friends, and probably never would be, but we'd reached a functional peace that worked for everyone involved. Beverly's relationship with me settled into something practical. She stopped by once a month to drop off the rent check in person, always early, always with a brief update about her job or the kids. She never asked about my finances again, never made comments about my apartment or my car or my clothes. When we saw each other at family gatherings, she was polite and distant, treating me with the kind of careful respect you give someone you've wronged badly. We weren't friends and probably never would be. Too much had happened. Too many years of cruel comments and deliberate humiliation that couldn't just disappear because circumstances changed. But we'd reached a functional peace that worked for both of us. She paid her rent on time, maintained the house properly, and treated me with genuine respect. I collected the rent, stayed out of her personal life, and rebuilt my relationship with Madison without Beverly's interference. The arrangement taught me something important about boundaries. Setting them didn't have to mean cutting people out completely or holding grudges forever. Sometimes boundaries just meant establishing clear rules and expectations, then enforcing them consistently. Beverly knew exactly where she stood with me now, and that clarity made everything easier. My investment portfolio hit $3.2 million in March. I logged into my account one morning before school and stared at the number for a solid 5 minutes, thinking about my grandmother and everything she'd taught me about money. She grew up poor during the Depression, saved every penny her entire life, invested carefully and consistently. When she died, she left me this gift with one simple instruction written in her will. Use it wisely, and never let anyone make you feel small for living within your means. For years, I'd just let the money sit there, watching it grow, but never really using it for anything meaningful. But now I was finally using it the way she would have wanted. The rental income from Beverly's house covered all the property expenses with money left over. I was maintaining my independence, living on my teacher salary by choice and helping family in a way that didn't enable bad behavior or reward cruelty. The money gave me options and security, but more importantly, it gave me the power to set boundaries and stick to them. Beverly had learned that treating people badly had consequences. Madison and the other kids had stable housing again. My family had learned to respect my choices even when they disagreed with them. My grandmother would have approved of all of it. Madison showed up at my apartment one Saturday afternoon with a shoebox full of craft supplies. She'd been coming over every other weekend for months now, and we'd fallen into comfortable routines. This time she announced she wanted to make birthday cards for 3 of her friends. She spread out construction paper, markers, stickers, and glitter all over my kitchen table and got to work. I made us grilled cheese sandwiches and watched her carefully fold the paper, draw elaborate designs, and write personalized messages inside each card. She told me she wanted to be a teacher like me when she grew up, that she'd been thinking about it a lot lately. She said her favorite teacher at the school made learning fun and really cared about the students, and that's what she wanted to do too. Then she said something that made my chest tight. Homemade gifts are special because they take time and thought. Anyone can buy something at a store, but making something yourself means you actually care about the person. Store-bought stuff is just stuff, but homemade things are different. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom so she wouldn't see me cry. All those years of Beverly mocking my handmade quilts and knitted scarves, telling Madison and the other kids that homemade gifts were inferior because I couldn't afford real presents. And here was Madison, at 11 years old, understanding something her mother never had. She got it. She understood that the value of a gift wasn't in its price tag, but in the time and care put into making it. When I came back to the kitchen, she had glitter in her hair and marker on her hands, completely absorbed in her project. She looked up and smiled at me, and I knew everything I'd been through was worth it for this moment. A year after the auction, my life looked almost exactly the same from the outside. I still taught American history to sophomores who mostly didn't care about the Revolutionary War. I still lived in my one-bedroom apartment with my Target furniture and my 10-year-old Toyota. I still made homemade gifts for birthdays and holidays, still shopped at thrift stores, still packed my lunch every day. But everything was different now. The rent checks from Beverly arrived like clockwork, covering the mortgage I never had to take out on the house I bought in cash. My family treated me with respect instead of pity. Madison spent every other weekend with me, and we were closer than we'd ever been. Beverly had learned that actions have consequences, that treating people badly eventually catches up with you. I'd proved my point without destroying my family or making the kids suffer more than they already had. Sometimes the best revenge really was just living well and setting boundaries that actually stuck. I didn't need Beverly to grovel or apologize constantly. I didn't need my parents to admit they'd been wrong about everything. I just needed people to treat me with basic respect and understand that kindness couldn't be taken for granted. The house sat there in the nice neighborhood with the good schools, generating income every month while Beverly rebuilt her life inside it. And I went to work every day, teaching kids about history and coming home to my modest apartment, perfectly content with my choices.